Welcome to the course Introduction to Azure. I'm your instructor, Corey Hines. To give you a little background on where I come from, I'm a subject matter expert for Microsoft, a Microsoft MVP in data center and cloud automation. Do a lot of things with Microsoft. Been working with the technology now for a number of years, ranging from database administrators to, I was once a professional developer, but most of my work's been done around building, managing, deploying data centers and large environments. So this course, we're going to kind of look at the largest of the large environments, which is Microsoft Azure. So to begin, let's take a look at the agenda for the course. So there's 5 major things in this course. Number 1, we'll introduce cloud computing. We want to get an idea of, what is cloud computing? Why does it matter? Why do we care? And this is not just as it relates to Microsoft's implementation of cloud computing, which is of course Azure, but this applies to Amazon, Google, to all the third-party big and small cloud providers that are out there, so you understand, what is the whole excitement around cloud? Why do we care? Why do we want to get involved? Then we'll look at Azure's version of cloud. What does cloud mean to Microsoft? What does Azure provide? What are the solutions it gives you? And then start looking at the basics, the kind of the intro on how we think about managing Azure. We're obviously not going to get into building applications for Azure because this is focused for IT professionals, but we're going to look at things like, what are the portals? There are 2 Azure portals. Why are there 2? What do you use one for versus the other? What can you do in one versus the other? And what are the fundamental differences? We'll also look at the 2 major management and deployment models for Azure, something called Azure Service Management and Azure Resource Management. Now, these are very different. They relate to the portals that you use. They relate to the way that you create and manage objects. It's important to mention now that the bulk of what we're going to focus on in this and the related courses is the ARM method, the Azure Resource Manager method of deploying objects within Azure. And then finally, Azure PowerShell. Now, I've said, if you've ever seen me teach a course or attended one of my sessions, in order for you to be successful in the world today in IT, you've got to have a fundamental understanding of PowerShell. Azure's no exception. A lot of what you do in Azure can only be done in PowerShell. There's a lot you can do in the portals, but Azure is a very PowerShell first platform. You can first do things in PowerShell, and then the most common things that you can do in PowerShell evolve into Azure. So we're going to be looking at these 5 topics over the duration of this course. So in this module, we're going to look at what is Azure and what is cloud computing. To begin, let's look at kind of a general definition of what cloud computing is. And I kind of want to start with number 7 down here. If you look on the internet, you start looking up cloud computing, eventually you're going to come across someone who's built a t-shirt that says, it's not a cloud, it's just someone else's computer. And in the grand scheme of things, that's true. Cloud computing is large companies that provide computing resources that you pay for typically on a consumption-based model. So if you think about a regular corporation, you buy a bunch of servers, you set up a data center, you're paying for those servers whether they're busy or not. And if you think about how you capacity plan for a data center, you typically have to plan for the largest workload you're going to have. So if you're for example, I don't know, like an accounting company, you might have over the course of a year, a pretty predictable workload, but then around tax time, your workload goes way up here. Well, if you're planning a data center and planning your own hardware, you've got to buy the hardware for this level. And that could be extremely expensive. What cloud computing allows you to do is operate at the level you need, and then when you need more computing power, scale up. So you can buy just what you need, just when you need it, use it, and then essentially return it again. It's renting capacity for a very, very short period of time. And in the world of cloud computing, we introduced the term of what's called elasticity, or things being elastic. And that means you can scale up and you can scale down incredibly fast. There are cloud applications in the world, for example, that scale up in seconds to support thousands of additional users, and then maybe 20 seconds later, scale down again. It all depends on how it's designed and how it's built. The other big benefit you get from cloud computing is someone else manages very complex infrastructure. So not only do you not have to buy the hardware, you don't need the people. you can rely on the expertise of the cloud provider to handle very complex, very expensive, very difficult to manage hardware, software, and services implementations. When you think of cloud computing, you have to think of agility. When we think of the design of applications that run in a cloud-focused world, typically they're what we call loosely coupled microservices. Now, it's a very kind of, sort of complex sounding way of describing things, but what it basically means is applications are broken down into very small pieces. And those individual pieces can scale up, can scale down, and can be distributed automatically using policies and rules. Typically, it's very standard hardware. Most cloud providers, the misconception is that they use very complex, very expensive hardware. The reality is the opposite. Most cloud providers use basic hardware, cheap, simple, easy to manage, easy to replace, and they have a lot of it. It's typically very focused on services. Rather than you paying for infrastructure, you pay for the service. So if you think about storage, you would buy some hard drives. Well, if you think about storage as a service, you pay for the storage of those files. You don't think about how they're backed up, what they're stored on, or who manages them. You simply pay for it as a service. And then for many cloud providers, they're going to introduce standardized way of performing configuration. In the case of Azure, this is through PowerShell and something called an ARM template that we're going to talk about in a little while. When we start talking about cloud, you'll always hear the term private, public, and hybrid. Well, what does that mean? A public cloud is a cloud that anybody can use. For example, anybody can use Amazon Web Services, anybody can use Azure, anybody can use Google Cloud. As long as you have essentially a credit card, you can leverage that. A private cloud is something that's owned and managed by an organization. Now, typically, only the most sophisticated IT organizations will have a true private cloud because it requires, quite a bit of investment both in people and in hardware and technology to assemble a cloud. You've also got to have a legitimate need for it. Are you a company that's going to scale up and scale down and provide computing services to other parts of your organization or other companies? And then finally, a hybrid cloud is a combination of the two. Now, the reality is most companies that leverage cloud technology leverage the hybrid cloud model. They have some notion of applications, data, infrastructure that they own and they manage in their own centers. And they also supplement that with public or private cloud. So going back to my accounting example from a few minutes ago, here we are. If I'm that accounting firm and I look at my workload and I go like this, I might buy the hardware to be able to operate at my average level throughout the course of the year. And I may run my accounting applications on that hardware, for 9 months or 10 months or 11 months of the year. But during that 1 or 2 months of accounting season, I may purchase public cloud capacity to supplement my hardware. Now, this is the reality that most companies are in. They have some infrastructure on site, they have some applications on site, and they'll leverage public cloud so they can scale up, allowing them to invest at a more realistic level in the hardware they need on their own locations. Now, when we think about what's in a cloud, well, what are the typical services that a cloud provide? And again, defining some of the acronyms that typically relate to cloud. The first one we're going to work with is called infrastructure as a service. We're going to start with the second one here on the list. Infrastructure as a service refers to providing you with the ability to run what is essentially virtual machines. So I'm going to give you a network where you can install things like Hyper-V virtual machines or other types of virtual machines, and you can run them and manage them, but you don't have to buy the underlying hardware. But you're responsible for things like updates, patches, configuration, security. We then have the notion of platform as a service. And platform as a service it's a little more abstracted. So maybe this is not a virtual machine where it's, you manage the operating system. Maybe platform as a service is, I'm giving you access to databases and websites. So it's services that run within operating systems, so you don't have to worry about, for example, patching a SQL server. You just subscribe to a database. but then you have to build the application to write, to manage, to read data, to add things. You have to build the app that uses the database. Software as a service takes it to a more abstracted level. And this is when you begin to think about, I want to go online and I want to subscribe to a web-based accounting package, or a web-based travel package, or in the case of Microsoft Office 365, web-based versions of Word, Excel, and PowerPoint. You're not worrying about the infrastructure it's running on. You're not worrying about the databases and the web servers. You're subscribing to the complete package based on how you use it. So if you've ever gone online and used a travel site like Expedia, that's to a degree software as a service. If you've ever used Salesforce.com, if you've ever used Office 365, if you've ever used QuickBooks Online, these are all examples of software as a service. And then finally, some companies offer what are called packages as a service. So this combines a combination of all three. For example, disaster recovery. There are companies that will offer disaster recovery as a service, where they'll manage your entire infrastructure, all your data, all your apps, and give you the ability to recover that immediately regardless of what it is. So you don't have to think about it. You simply subscribe to a service level for whatever combination of packages that you want. When we think about what options we have at a more granular level of detail, what are the compute options up in the cloud? Well, the first one is a virtual machine. Now this is, for most people who think about cloud, especially IT pros that think about cloud, virtual machines are the first thing that comes to mind. I don't want to deploy Hyper-V and storage and networking in my data center. I just want a place to run my virtual machines. I have a virtual machine, it has a piece of software, maybe it's Linux, maybe it's Windows. I just want a place to run it. Well, services like Azure give you a place to run your virtual machine, and they'll worry about the performance, the reliability, and the availability. We have the notion of what are called cloud services. Cloud services are collections of components that put together to deliver things like virtual machines. For example, public IP addresses, storage, and the virtual machine itself. We have remote app. If you've ever run a terminal server, I use the legacy term because I think that's an easy term to understand. If you've ever run a terminal server, you can actually run your terminal servers in Azure and deliver only the applications you need without you worrying about having to deploy terminal server. This is an example of the package service we talked about a few minutes ago. We have the service fabric, which allows you to distribute application data, and something that's fairly new is something called the Azure Container Service. So if you've ever worked with Docker or heard of Docker, you can deploy Docker-style containers running either Windows or Linux on Azure and leverage the benefits of containers for application deployment. And then finally, we have something called the App Service. The App Service allows you to deploy entire applications and distribute them for both PC and mobile implementations. You can automate the installation of the application, you can distribute the data, and you can use standard tools such as Visual Studio or other languages that you're familiar with to build these applications. So when we think about these different options on how we can actually go in and build different applications and different solutions for Azure, it's important to note that with each of these methods that we can choose, there's benefits, there's drawbacks, and there's differences. So this slide provides you kind of a good example of how you would think about that. Number one, Azure Virtual Machines. Azure Virtual Machines give you the most control and the most flexibility. However, you are responsible for all the management, so there's a great deal of work. So when we think about how easy it is, or the flexibility you get, low ease of management, low agility with virtual machines, because you have to manage the operating system. But if you can run it on an operating system such as Linux or Windows, you can run it in Azure. Cloud services give you a little more flexibility, but not all applications can run in cloud services. If you have an application that runs, for example, within IIS, you may have to make some modifications to run that, for example, in an Azure website. So this up here, IIS, would run just fine. An Azure website, down here, you may need to make some modifications to the application. And then finally, If you move it to a true cloud-focused app, you may have to make additional modifications, but you'll notice that the flexibility, the management gets much, much better. So it's balancing trade-offs. When you build an application, when you build a solution, you need to choose sort of the investment level. Do you want to simply replace your data center with cloud? You can leverage virtual machines. Do you want to take full advantage of cloud, completely restructure, rebuild, modify your application to leverage the advantage of cloud? Then you can use other capabilities such as app service for better management, better agility, and in the grand scheme of things, potentially lower cost. So that's a quick look at what we mean by cloud computing, what are some of the big benefits of cloud computing, and we'll start by looking at now in our next module, our next section, some of the more details of how Azure implements cloud computing. In this module, we'll take a quick look at what Azure is as a platform. So we talked about cloud computing in general. Let's take a specific look at what Azure is as a cloud platform. Now, the whole notion behind Azure is, this is Microsoft's implementation of a cloud, and it's built around what Microsoft feels their customers need based on surveys they've done, based on research they've done. So the first thing to kind of bear in mind when we think about Azure is that Azure is a hybrid cloud. It's not a solution that is designed to be only up in the cloud, only up in Azure. It's designed to supplement what you already have in your existing investments in both infrastructure and application development. So some basic things you can do with Azure. You can create customized dashboards. For example, here's my Azure subscription. I like to keep mine really, really simple. I've got a dashboard that shows me the health of everything I've got deployed, and then what I'm charging and what I'm being billed per month. That's what I want to look at when I quickly log on to Azure. And so, as an administrator, you can build these dashboards that give you a really quick look at, what's the current state of health of both Azure and also the applications and services that I happen to care about. You can create virtual machines. For example, I can create both Windows and Linux virtual machines. Microsoft embraces Linux as a platform for applications, and it's kind of a, from someone that's been in the industry a long time, it's kind of a new position for them that Microsoft's fully embracing Linux. So you can create both Windows and Linux virtual machines through this notion of a marketplace. And we'll talk about what the marketplace is and how it works in a little while. So through that marketplace, you can deploy hundreds of different virtual machines, some containing just basic operating systems, others containing full application stacks. For example, there's a LAMP stack virtual machine that contains Apache PHP. There's virtual machines that contain Oracle. There's virtual machines that contain SAP. There's virtual machines that contain appliances such as firewalls, network scanners, intrusion detection systems. So there's a lot of options and a lot of different virtual machines that you can pick and choose. Prior to this, you'd have to go to the vendor, buy the software, build it and install it yourself. Now with Azure, in just a click or two, you can deploy something. Let's have a look at this as a quick example. If I simply go new, I'm now in the marketplace, and if I look at virtual machines, you can see there's a pretty elaborate list just showing me the most popular ones. For example, here's a SQL Server virtual machine that will install both Windows and SQL Server ready to go. And if you've ever installed SQL Server, it's not something you do over a cup of coffee. You've got to think about it. You've got to wait for it to run. This, with one click, type a few answers, you've now got a running copy of SQL Server. You can deploy web and mobile apps. So apps that are specifically designed to run on phones and integrate into various stores. And you can also create managed databases. I've dealt with over the years many administrators where, the only thing they wanted was a database. And for me to give them a database, I've got to set up a copy of Windows, I've got to patch it, I've got to get it on the network, I've got to secure it. Then I've got to go install SQL Server, patch it, configure it. So the expertise required by me to, is pretty large. I've got to be a Windows administrator, I've got to be a database administrator. So they can have, a database for some simple application or some, low use case. With Azure, I can simply create a database in Azure. I don't need any knowledge of how to install, configure, or manage SQL Server. I can simply create a database, and the database as a service means that Microsoft on the back end is going to make sure that that database is on a healthy, reliable, backed up, and performing well server. And that's just a snapshot. There's a lot more in Azure that you can leverage. There are literally hundreds and hundreds of different things. The marketplace, as we mentioned, is where you find that. And so as examples of some of the things you can find in the marketplace: data and analytics options, security and identity, infrastructure. I can create networks, I can create firewalls, I can create rules, I can create massive storage and cheap storage, create containers, machine learning. So I can leverage the knowledge of Azure and the expertise of Azure and the compute power of Azure to perform very deep data analysis and machine learning, and also media streaming. I can capture, record video, and distribute and stream video to many, many subscribers all at the same time, all through Azure. So it literally is a platform that contains everything you need to do virtually every business function that you can think of. Some other examples of resources that are not necessarily, things you deploy on Azure: the marketplace. Anyone can build a solution for the Azure marketplace. So if you're a company and you have a product, you can sell that product through the Azure marketplace. You simply need to build it, you apply, it gets certified, it gets tested and checked and so on, and it's added to the marketplace. We have the VM Depot, which is a community-driven library of virtual machines. We have GitHub. Microsoft is heavily invested in GitHub, both for documentation, APIs, and sharing, and as well for the distribution of what we call ARM templates. And we're going to leverage GitHub a couple of times throughout these courses so you can see how it's used. And then finally, the Azure Trust Center, which is a lot of guidance around, as you move to the cloud, one of the biggest concerns companies have is, hey, my data was in my data center, it was behind a lock and key. It's on the cloud now, how do I know it's secure? How do I know it's trusted? And it's guidance, policy, compliance rules that help you both implement it correctly and understand what's been done so that you can know that your data is safe and secure while it's stored in the cloud. So let's take a look at how Microsoft implements its data centers to support its cloud strategy. When we think about what Microsoft does and what it focuses on, the first one is obviously reliability. If you're going to take all your customers and all their data and all their services and load that onto your data centers, you better make sure those data centers are fault tolerant, highly available, and reliable. And a core tenet of the investment and the design of Azure is around reliability, both internally and also giving you the option to distribute things like VM workloads, applications, and data across many, many different data centers in many countries or regions to make sure that, in addition to what Microsoft is doing, you can choose how to distribute and back up your data for the maximum reliability. Security and compliance, ensuring that it's compliant with not only local and federal government regulations, but to give you the option to enforce corporate policies around data. And then finally, environmental sustainability. Data centers obviously require a lot of power, and making sure that we focus on green data centers and data centers that minimize the environmental footprint is a core tenet of how these data centers are designed. Now, there's a lot of information that you can go online on, anywhere from YouTube to Microsoft.com to Azure.com, and see videos and documentation on how things like the data center design is done. It's really quite revolutionary, the way that they've designed the pod systems, the way the infrastructure is done, and some of the statistics are actually pretty astounding. So for example, to give you some idea, about 1.4 million databases on Azure. And this data, by the way, I can guarantee you is old, because you're watching this at least a day after I recorded it, so this is now old data. Millions of users in Active Directory. 1.5 trillion messages per month in Azure Internet of Things, 777 trillion storage transactions per day. It's been said that the fiber optic in North America alone can circle the globe, I think, about 6 times, and that there's enough cable to go to the moon and back. 100% of servers and electronic equipment recycled after decommissioning. Again, that kind of goes back to that point on environmental sustainability. We think about some of the other design points. There's a global distribution model. Microsoft's managed it, and it's a modular architecture. all the data centers are made up of individual pods that are brought in as a unit. So there's this unit of compute power that can simply be built, manufactured, and plugged in, and then that adds a certain amount of capability to an Azure data center. Everything runs both Windows Server, which is the same Windows Server that you run in your data center. I was going to say at home, but in your data center, wherever your data center happens to be. When we think about locations, I'm not going to use the slide because I'm going to jump in and just kind of take a look. This is the Azure Dashboard, so this is going to be the most current information all the time. Every green checkbox represents an Azure data center location, and there are more data center locations planned all the time. So you can see there's a pretty large cluster around North America, there's a couple of data centers in Europe, and there's a pretty large segment of data centers all around the Asia Pacific Rim, both in Japan, down in Singapore and Australia, and as well a couple in India. So wherever the world's computing power is needed, there's Azure data centers that are definitely close by. When we look at the services that are available in these data centers, the categories go across the top. So when you think about, what can we actually do inside all these data centers? It's worth noting, by the way, that not all services are available in all data centers. For example, some data centers don't support the latest generation virtual machine, the very, very large virtual machines, because the hardware that's installed in the data centers may be a couple of years old, so it supports some of the smaller generation virtual machines. But under the compute category, we have things like cloud services, service fabric, virtual machine scale sets, containers. Under data and storage, we have SQL databases. We have StoreSimple, which is a file storage mechanism for uploading files from your local network into Azure managed storage. Under analytics, we have machine learning and something called Data Lake for massive quantities of data. For Internet of Things, this is things like your internet-connected fridge. There's what are called notification hubs that facilitate communication, so your fridge has the ability to report when you need more milk. Under networking, we have things like DNS. You can manage DNS servers in Azure, and then you can implement load balancers and traffic managers. We have media distribution. For hybrid, we have something called Azure Site Recovery that allows you to have virtual machines and infrastructure in your data center, but if your data center goes offline, automatically fail to an Azure instance of your virtual machines. So it keeps it in sync, keeps it up to date. If you go offline, it fails over directly into Azure. And then finally, for identity, as we move to the world of bring your own device to work, to where the device that you have is when you pick up in your local electronics store, it's not something that's issued and managed by your company. It's not something that's subject to, for example, group policy. How do you manage user identity across this world of online applications, multiple companies, and then devices that you don't maintain or manage? Azure Active Directory and Azure Identity allow you to do that. And we'll see some examples of this in other courses on how we set up things like Azure Active Directory and how we federate with external applications. For developers, we have Azure Visual Studio Team Services. In the past, developers would collaborate, but they required what was essentially connectivity on the same LAN. So you'd VPN into work, upload your code, check out your code. With Azure Team Services and Visual Studio Team Services on Azure, that can now be centralized. So as long as you have an internet connection, you can connect to and collaborate with other developers. There's also Azure Dev Test Labs that allow you to automate the deployment of full environments. For example, I have an application that requires 10 servers to fully test. Azure Dev Test Labs gives you the ability to do a template and deploy a test lab to run it and test on your application. And then finally, for management, things like automation. So we can do scripting, schedulers, log analytics to analyze event logs. You can have servers upload their event logs to Azure. Azure Log Analytics will scan those event logs and bring to your attention things that look like they should be checked out. Errors that maybe need some additional attention. Now, we mentioned that not everything is available everywhere. Again, this is, by all means not something that I would expect you to read. However, it gives you a sense that depending on the data center, depending on the location, the services may vary. Now, there's a website you can go to, azure.microsoft.com, Regions, that will let you break down in incredible detail exactly what's available in each region. So as you plan your implementation, as you figure out, what is it you need, you can visit that website and see where it's available to determine if it's available close to you or if maybe you've got to go somewhere else. The good thing that you can kind of, if you look at this in, in any amount of depth, in every major geographic region of the world, you can get everything. It may be not, East, it may be available in East US, but not East US 2, for example, but it's going to be available in North America. So you're going to be generally close to whatever component of Azure it is that you want to use. So that gives you a sense of, what is Azure's implementation of cloud and just kind of the scale. Obviously there's a lot there. We're focused in this course on the role of IT professionals and how we administer and manage Azure. But as you begin to think about it, you can see how, for developers, there's a component for Azure. For administrators, there's components for Azure. For business users and data scientists, there's components in Azure. So it's a very comprehensive, very large platform. In this module, let's take a look at the Azure Portals. So as we begin to learn how to administer Azure, the first place we'll logically begin is with one of the two Azure portals. And we'll begin with our first look at what's called the Classic Portal. The Classic Portal, which you can see here live, is the first portal that Azure released. And we'll just point out a couple of quick characteristics. Down the side here, we can see all the different types of objects. And then in the middle, there's a place where you can go administer and configure settings of different types of objects by clicking on an arrow key and then looking at various properties. Now, we'll take a look at this portal in a little more detail in a couple of minutes. But before we do, let's take a look at some of the major characteristics of this portal. The key thing you have to remember is that this portal uses what's known as the Service Management Model, or Azure ASM, Azure Service Management. This is significant because it changes things like the PowerShell commandlets you're going to use and the way that resources are deployed. This was the original deployment of Azure. It was often referred to as Azure version 1 or IaaS version 1. And everything that you deployed via this portal was wrapped up in what was called a cloud service. So we'll look right here. You'll notice it mentions that it was wrapped up in what was called a cloud service. The cloud service acted as a container for objects. So when you deployed, for example, a virtual machine, it was deployed within a cloud service, which is where things like the networking came from. It's where things like the IP addresses came from. And you manage these cloud services as a way of managing the virtual machines. The deployment was also linear, as in it was step by step. When you wanted to deploy something, you created the container, the IP address, the storage, the networking, the virtual machine. It was very sequential. It was done via scripting. So you focused on the flow of what you wanted to create from step one all the way through to the final step, however many steps were involved. That's what the Classic Portal focused on. And there's a set of commandlets that are focused on this Azure Service Management Model. And the Classic Portal is focused on the Azure Service Management Model. So let's take a look, kind of take a tour around that Classic Portal and just see what it looks like and what we can do. The place to start learning Azure is with the Classic Portal. Now, to access the Classic Portal, we're just going to navigate to the website manage.windowsazure.com and log in with the credential that's associated with our subscription. Now, when you log in, it's going to go ahead and load the portal. Now, to begin, let's just kind of get oriented with what's in this portal and what are the components and what are we looking at as we kind of browse through. So we'll give this just a second to load. The layout is pretty straightforward. All the assorted services and objects and things we can create and manage are here on the left. Over here on the right, we have a menu where we can access information about our subscription and do things like change our password, look at our bill, to see what the charges are going to be, and contact support. To use the portal, it's pretty straightforward. Let's create a new website just as a point of getting started. So we're going to come in here, click Web Apps, and here on the bottom, we've got a New button. Now we can also, there's a shortcut available, and for many things there will be. We'll just click New, and then we've got some categories of services and some different objects we can create. So we're going to create a new web app. We'll use a quick create, so just minimal settings. It's going to ask us to pick a URL for our website. And I'm just going to call this one CH Website 001. And Azure, behind the scenes, checks to see if this name is actually available. The green check mark indicates it is. And we want a location. I'm going to put this one in East US. And then a service plan. And we're just going to have it create a service plan. We don't need to worry about it at this stage, what a service plan is. It's something that a website needs, and it's going to create it as part of creating the website. We'll click Create. And it's going to submit a job, but you can see here the status is now creating the website in the background. And this is a very simple, very basic website. You can see the pricing tier is actually free. So we'll let this create and then kind of take a look at what we get. All right, so the website's created and it is now running. And so to use this portal, we kind of have two things we can do. We've got this list, which would have all the different objects, whether this is a web app, a virtual machine, a mobile service, or whatever else we created. We click on the little arrow, and now we can access all the settings. We can navigate back, and then again go forward and look at the settings. And so all the settings are obviously going to be different for each individual type of object that you create. In the case of a website, we've got some tools that we can install. We've got some options to publish things. And then we've got some options to stop it, restart the website, or even browse to the website. This website at the moment is blank, so there's nothing here. So as another example, let's go ahead and create a virtual machine. So click over here on there's a couple of ways we can do this. We can go to the view of all objects. We can click virtual machines, or we can just come down here and click new. So let's go new, compute, virtual machine, do a quick create, a virtual machine name, call this one CHVM001, and we can see that name's available. An operating system, we'll just pick Windows Server R2 Data Center. A size, we'll do 2-core 7 gig memory, an administrator name, and a password. And it's going to check and make sure the passwords match. Region, and then click Create Virtual Machine. And this again, just like it did with the website, is going to submit a job in the background. And we can go down here in the lower right and we can actually check on kind of what's going on. We can see the website's created, we can dismiss that, and the virtual machine is being created right now. If I come back up to all items, we can see we've got our web app that's running, and then we've got this new virtual machine that we've begun the process of creating. So it's really that simple. That's the classic Azure portal. In many cases, you're going to get here when you initially log on to Azure. And the next thing we'll take a look at is the new Azure portal, which has a lot more functionality. It's a little more complicated. There's a few more things, well, a lot more things you can do. But again, just to give you an idea of what's involved, pretty simple, pretty straightforward. This is the classic portal. Now let's take a look at the new portal. The new portal, which you can see here live, is a similar layout to the classic portal, but this is where you want to spend your time. This is where all the new functionality and the new features and new capability actually reside. In this new portal, you still have down the left-hand side all the different things you can create. But because there are so many of them, the list is kind of shortened and customized. And we can click on more services and add all the different things that we could typically work with or would want to work with to that new portal. And you can see already there's a lot more. The new portal, as we look at the characteristics, also uses the new Azure Resource Manager deployment model. And I'm going to kind of highlight that here, because when you think about, again, new versus classic, this is the biggest thing you've got to keep in mind. Anything you create and manage in the new portal is done using the Azure Resource Manager deployment method. And this is the deployment method that relies on certain PowerShell commandlets that are Azure RM commandlets, which we're going to see in a little bit, but also uses ARM templates. So rather than a script or a flow, step 1, step 2, step 3, you can declare as a unit everything that you want. I want a virtual machine that has some storage, has some networking, has some public IP addresses, and then Azure will create that for you, and it will take care of making sure that, for example, the storage account is created before the virtual machine. You don't have to worry about workflow or dependencies. Azure takes care of all that for you. Now, there is some support for classic deployment models in that new portal. However, you may find yourself as an administrator, depending on what you want to do, switching between the new portal and the old portal for certain tasks. And this is something that, over time, you'll get used to, and you'll learn, what's where and what do I use the old for versus the new. One example I can give you is that as of today, and we're about midway through August 2016, Azure Active Directory is managed primarily in the old portal. They're in the process of moving that functionality to the new portal, but it's not done yet. So you're going to use the old portal, the classic portal, for things like Azure Active Directory. So with that in mind, let's kind of dig into the new portal and just take a look at how things are laid out and how we work with it. So now let's move from the classic portal into the new portal. And to do that, if you're logged onto the classic portal, they're going to prompt you a whole bunch to kind of check out the new portals. Or you can come over here in the menu and check it out from here. So we'll switch to the new portal. And right away, you're going to see that this is a pretty drastic change. The basics are still kind of the same. We've got objects that we can create. We've got a menu of objects down the left-hand side. Over here on the right, we can access our settings, such as our bill, for example. And in the middle, our list has been replaced with a series of tiles. And tiles can be customized, and you kind of change the layout of this. We can add tiles, remove tiles. There's an edit dashboard option. We can, for example, call this my subscription. And then we can, move some things around. For example, I don't want this help and support tile. I don't want the marketplace tile. I'm going to move the all resources just kind of down right here. And we can kind of do this all day long and customize, that initial dashboard view to be whatever you want it to be. Creating objects is straightforward as well. So let's go in and create, do what we did in the previous portal, which is create a basic virtual machine. But let's do this from the newer portal. And so to do that, we're just going to click New. And what that's going to bring up are what are called blades. And the whole notion of the new portal is that it's based around this idea of blades. Blades represent properties and configurations. And so we're going to go virtual machines. And we're just going to do a Windows Server 2012 R2 data center virtual machine. Now, we're not going to get into this in depth now, but the new portal uses a newer deployment model called a resource manager deployment model. And that's based around the notion of what are called resource groups. So, in addition to resource groups, also templates. In later modules, we're going to learn about how we manage resource groups and how we manage templates. So this is going to be a basic VM. I'm going to call this VM1. Storage type is going to be solid state, username, and a password. The subscription, and then the resource group. The resource group represents just a group of objects that are related that we kind of manage as a unit. Now we'll learn more about this later on. Create a new resource group. Call this one VMs, and then a location. So that's all our settings. And we're now ready to go ahead and create the virtual machine. So we'll click OK. Move on to our next set of configurations, which is going to be the size. And so this will pick the available sizes based on the region that I've selected. We'll go with a DS2 size, gives us a pricing estimate. And then any optional features we want. And so again, we're not going to get into all the different features in depth for now, but you can see it just kind of has some basic default network settings, some basic high availability settings, and then we're going to enable diagnostics. And so diagnostics is going to allow us to, get some information on the virtual machine on how it's performing. Click OK. And then finally, it's going to do a validation, make sure that it can actually do everything we've asked it to. We click OK, and it begins the process of deploying the virtual machine. And so you can see it creates a tile for the deployment on the home page. We've got a little alerts area up here. We can click to see that the deployment has started. And we can now kind of wait for this deployment to finish. We'll go ahead and click on the deployment tile, and we can kind of look in here and watch and see what's happening. If I scroll all the way to the bottom, we can refresh this view, and you'll see that it's beginning to create all the objects that Azure requires to actually build out this new virtual machine. So we'll let this run and just come back and take a quick look at it when it's done and kind of see how the new portal lets us go in and configure this virtual machine. So the deployment has completed, and we've been redirected to a settings blade for this particular virtual machine. So it shows us some basic information about the virtual machine, some actions we can take, such as restarting it, stopping it, deleting it, or connecting to the operating system, and gives us a shortcut to look at all the settings in a dedicated settings blade. And so this is how we navigate through this new portal. If we want to find things, we find the appropriate blade. We can search for settings. For example, address interfaces, I'm looking for TCP/IP properties. And here we can find the virtual machine's IP information. We can close a blade, we can maximize a blade, or restore it to its original size. If we close all our blades, we're redirected back to our home page, right? So where we have our initial dashboard, and we've now got a new tile for that virtual machine. We can go ahead and open that tile to get back to our properties page. Or if we don't want that tile, we can actually just remove the tile entirely. Over here on the right now, I can look at all resources to see everything that's running in my subscriptions. You can see that there's quite a number of objects right now. Or for the newer objects I've deployed, I can look at my resource group view to see which resource groups I actually have. And then within each resource group, look at the objects that make up that particular group. Here's my virtual machine 1 resource group, and here's all the objects that are contained within it. Deleting objects from the new portal is also pretty straightforward. For example, if I want to delete all these objects, I can just delete the resource group. So I'll come up here in the resource groups blade, click delete. Now, because deleting a resource group deletes a lot of things, they want you to confirm just by typing the name. And it'll now go in, delete all those objects, effectively cleaning up and removing everything I just did. So that's a basic tour through the new Azure portal. So regardless of which portal you choose to use, the way that you pay for something in Azure is through something called a subscription. Now, a subscription is just, you giving Microsoft your information so you can pay for things. Subscriptions can be on credit cards where you bill month to month. Subscriptions can be based on access codes where you're given a certain amount of free capacity for a trial, for example. Or subscriptions can be based on yearly prepay models. There's all sorts of options, and those options are changing all the time. So simply, work with Microsoft, contact Microsoft when you're ready, and figure out what type of subscription is best for you. Now, in all cases, you can actually manage your subscriptions through the Azure portal. There's a page, which is account.windowsazure.com/subscriptions, but in both portals, both the new and the old, in the upper right-hand corner, if you click your username, there's typically a View My Bill or Manage My Subscriptions entry. That's the new portal. That was the old. Here's the new portal, where you can look at exactly what's in your bill, and you can see, how you're being charged and how those charges are being managed. In the new portal, you can see that we have this tile it gives us that has a neat little graph that shows, so far to date I've spent $87 US, and I can click on this and it'll take me to a breakdown of what those charges are and how I'm actually spending my money. And you can see that for me, the compute hours in US East has made up the bulk of the spend that I've had for this month. So both these portals give you the ability to manage, access, and view your bill, and also do things like change your credit card information. There's also a number of PowerShell commandlets. Now, this is the first time we've begun to look at PowerShell, and you've heard me talk about two portals, the old portal and the new portal. The difference, if you recall, is that the new portal uses the Azure Resource Manager method. The old portal does not. And I'd mentioned that that determines the PowerShell commandlets you use. Have a look at these PowerShell commands. You'll notice that I have get Azure Subscription and get Azure RM Subscription. If I want to manage functionality that's in the new portal, I'm going to use the Azure RM version of the PowerShell command. If I want to manage functionality in the old portal, I'm going to use the non-RM, or just the get Azure Subscription or set Azure Subscription. And you're going to find this is true for every PowerShell command with Azure. If you're creating a VM, there's a create Azure VM and a create Azure RM VM. Now, again, it sounds confusing. Over time, as you start to work with it, this stuff will become second nature. So let's take a look at some of the things we can do just to manage our subscriptions. Let's take a look at a couple of places where Azure can give us information about the subscription that we're using to access and run resources. So there's two different places we can do this depending on the portal that you're actually using. Here we have the classic portal, and if we kind of go over to the left and scroll to the bottom, under our settings area, we can see the subscriptions that we're currently using. Now you can actually have more than one active subscription at a time. If you have, for example, a corporate subscription and a personal subscription, and they're both associated with the same account, you can see both of those subscriptions here. We can also designate the administrators of our subscription. So for example, if I wanted to have another user be able to administer this, I could simply add and then add their email address and grant them administrator access to my subscription. In the upper right, if I click my username, I can view my bill. And that takes a second to load, so I've already kind of looked at it. So we've opened it, we click our bill, and so what it's going to do is it's going to go in and look at all the different charges that are on the account, let us download either the current month's bill or a previous month's bill, and show us exactly where we're spending our money. And so we can see that right now, this is not a lot of activity in this subscription this month. We've got a little bit of compute hours, so some virtual machines. We've got some public IP addresses, and we've got a little bit of storage I/O. We can download our detailed usage in the event that you need to generate reports or you want to upload this into some analytical software. And we can also edit our details and manage our payments, such as what's the credit card that we're using. If I fast forward to the newer portal, I have a subscriptions node that shows me the subscriptions that are currently active. Now this is basically the same information, it just gives you a slightly different view. So instead of being taken to an additional web page, I'm taken to a blade for this subscription that shows me all the charges that I have, my burn rate, which is how much money I'm actually spending, so I can see if it's going up or down, and then some of those totals that we showed earlier. If I click settings, we can govern basic settings of our subscription, including things like quotas, spend quotas, permissions, and users that are allowed to administer the subscription. If I click my username, we have access to view the bill here as well. So that's a kind of a quick look at, once you have the subscription, how you can access information on who can manage it, what the subscriptions are, and how you actually get access to your bill within Azure.